No, I purposely didn't make, well, I just ordered a bunch of stuff that's coming tomorrow, but it's not exactly what you wanted. But I wanted to wait to order it for when we're away, and then we'll get it, it'll be here when we get back. What? Well, look in the freezer. You can barely open the freezer.
Oh, yelling.
Oh, sorry.
Hey, David.
Moderate yelling. Only moderate yelling.
How are you, David?
Good.
Good.
I had Tyrone here for a cameo performance, but he got a better offer.
Oh, well, I hope Tyrone makes an appearance.
Well, he might. Before this is all over, we'll get him to come by and give everybody a nod.
Well, for those of you that are joining us, I want you to enjoy a bit of a slideshow of David's work that we'll be talking about later on. But just make sure that if you have any questions as we progress during the show, that on your Zoom, you should be able to find a raise your hand, where you can raise your hand. And then that way, what we'll do is we will unmute you so you can ask your question, and that way we can see you, and you can, you can ask your question to David or myself, and we'll answer it. So enjoy the slideshow, and we'll be starting in a few minutes. The work that you're seeing now is from David's show that we had here at the gallery upstairs at Bob Corn Imaging. It was a little bit of a retrospective, and if it's something that after the discussion this evening, if you'd like to see it again, you're more than able, and please check out, it's on our website, bobcornimaging.com, and there's a gallery link. So you'll be able to review David's show again and the others that we've had over the past few years. So I'd like to welcome everybody again and appreciate you coming and, and participating today. For those of you that don't know who David Burnett is, shame on you, but David is considered by many to be one of the 100 most influential photographers in history. And not only is his work iconic, not only is he quite a remarkable man, he's really quite an amazing person. And as we go through the evening, please just again asking you to find on your Zoom panel how you can raise your hand. That way we can unmute you and you can ask your question directly to David. And as you saw through this slideshow, that there really is quite a remarkable body of work. And a lot of this stuff is very iconic that you've seen before, published in Time and Life and all those incredible magazines back in the day. And David was there everywhere. And very giving. He's, like I said, if you didn't know who David Burnett was, you would never know when you meet him. And I thank him greatly for doing this tonight with us, but also for being a friend and also somebody that I have the great honor of printing for. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Mr. David Burnett.
I'm going to unmute myself. How about that? Well, it's fun to be here. And just to set the record straight, I think the 100 most important photo thing was not for all time. It was for the year that they did it, which was a couple of years ago. But all time would have been, that's a little bigger deal. Let me just say that. But it was a fun thing when it happened. And the main thing was I was 3 notches ahead of Dave Kennerly on the list. So that was really all that mattered to me. Dave Kennerly is like a long time. I've known him for 50 years and good friend. And we kid about that all the time, especially when I'm ahead of him on a list, which doesn't happen that often. Anyway, it's fun to be here and had a great show. Is it 2 summers ago? So
I think so. I think it was a couple of years ago now.
Years ago, July, we had a show at the gallery upstairs. And frankly, the only reason I'm here today is I thought there was lobster involved. But apparently
You know, as you remember, we just do beer and pretzels.
That's right. But there'll always be a lobster. But it was a fun show, and it was a good space. And actually, I had, which you might think that Orleans is kind of an out of the way place, but I had two friends. One I hadn't really seen since for at least 40 years, since maybe our 10th college reunion. And another was a guy that I'd worked with in Vietnam in the early 70s, and I don't think I'd seen since about 1980. So, 40 years comes and goes in a real hurry. But it was fun to see people turning up on the Cape like that. So it's never as far away as you think it is.
Well, I hope people, David, I don't know if everybody can hear you really clearly. If you might be able to put your mic a little closer to your mouth.
All right. Is that any better?
Yeah, sounds better to me.
Okay.
And what I'd like to do now is just to go through the images one by one so David can talk about them. And not only do we have the images from the show, but we also have images from a body of work that David was doing called The Fourth Quarter, that when we get to that, he'll be able to talk and share all that information with you. And this is just a very special image, I know, for David, and I kind of love it. The star of David's world, from what I understand lately, is Tyrone. And there's this great little picture of Tyrone.
They call him Little Tyrone, and this was the day he was getting his learner's permit. And 12 pounds. And what has been really great is that, you wear out the members of your family by using them to test lenses. And then that whole lens testing thing kind of wears thin after, 3, 5, 10 years. So Tyrone, he's still his own man. I have to deal with his agent. But basically, if I want to see if a lens is sharp, I just kind of try and focus on his little snout. And there's plenty of sharp little bits there to focus on. And, we went about 30 years between dogs. So it's been getting another puppy, which we did a couple of years ago. Well, actually, 2 weeks, he's going to be 7 years old. So we've had him for almost 7 years. But yeah, I mean, everybody who doesn't like a dog. And I have to say, now that you have the picture of President Obama, I don't think I ever photographed the Obama dog, which was that big Portuguese water dog that kind of ran the roost for a while. This was from the 2008 presidential campaign, about 5 or 6 days before the election. And you can see that the shape of the frame is not quite square, but it's much more square than a 35 millimeter. And that's because it was shot with a 4x5 camera, 4 inches by 5 inches. And it has, as a large format camera, it just has a lot of interesting things going on with it that are very different than 35 millimeter, which tends to be either film or 35 digital, tends to be what most people are using these days. Not everybody, but I would say most people are into that 2x3 format instead of the 2x2.5, which is what this is. And I started shooting 4x5 in 2003. It was at the time of the beginning of what was going to be the Iraq War, and I knew I wasn't going to go to the war. I just was like already too old at that point. But I wanted to try and do something in Washington, where I was living in DC, to do something that was different than just your standard, everybody, what it really came down to was that in 2003, everybody was getting into digital cameras, and autofocus came in 1990, and from there digital was like another 10 years later. And by 2002, 2003, everybody was shooting with the same couple of lenses: a 70 to 200, a 24-70, 17 to 35, or a 16 to 35, or a 20 to 35, depending on what era you were or what brand you were shooting. But I got a little bit tired of just having the same gear as everybody else. And even though clearly everyone was making their own pictures with that gear, there was something just gnawing at me, and I wanted to get into some other look. And I had already a 50 or 60-year-old speed graphic that I had bought from my friends at the Salt Lake Tribune back in the late 80s. I think I paid them $200 for it, and I probably paid about $10 too much. So I still have the camera and still works. But it was just kind of an entrance into trying to figure out another way to shoot. And 2003, there was still a great accessibility and affordability of Polaroid 4x5, the single sheets. And I really got very fond of the Poznag, which gave you a print, but more importantly, it gave you a negative. And you didn't have to process it right away because it wasn't in a film pack that automatically developed each picture. You could take it out without processing it, and that would give you a chance to take them all back to the hotel that night and take all 10 sheets and run them at once and have a little bit more control over it. But I got into shooting 4x5, and I really enjoyed the fact that it kind of slowed everything down, and it made it all about one picture. And it wasn't ever going to, with 4x5, it's never about a sequence, really. There's a few sequences that which things build very slowly, but it's not 5 frames a second. It's like one frame every 20 or 30 seconds. But it gave me a chance to try and look at things very differently and look at the way I was seeing differently. And I think anytime you change your way of shooting, and I had gone through the usual 35 thing like everybody else, and in the 1990s, I started shooting with roll film cameras, shooting 6x6, 6x7, 6x9. And I even still have one here, a Holga 30, well, they're about $40 now, plastic, Chinese little square image camera. Made a couple of pictures with it that made it worth having. People was like, how can you use a $20 camera? Well, if you take the right camera to the right job, you're going to be okay. And there are times when even the Holga is the right camera. But I love shooting the 4x5. I still shoot 4x5. I found a couple of fast lenses, which let me kind of regain some of the spontaneity that I had lost at the very beginning. This was another 4x5 of Ted Kennedy that was shot in a really dark, dark doesn't really do it justice. It was a dark hallway. And over his shoulder on the right of the picture is a corridor going down to his office. But I had seen that on his right, going that way, I guess, or that way, no, maybe that way, our left, there was an office. There was an office door, and the door was open. And when the door was open, all the light from the windows would spill out into this little hallway. And I measured it. It was like a 30th at f2. But I locked the camera down on a tripod. I probably shot 2, maybe 3 frames of this, and it just turned out to be the picture. So the thing I think the most interesting observation I would make is that you should not become a prisoner to your gear, but to figure out what it can do for you to free you up to see things in a way that maybe you hadn't seen them before. This picture of Gorbachev and Reagan meeting for the first time in Geneva in 1985. So that's, wow, 35 years ago. It's freaky. When you've been in this business a long time, everything you do is, that's 27 years ago, 32 years ago. And it's like, when you're 27 or 32, you just don't think like that. When you get to be older and you've been working for 50 years, I guess it just happens. But this was the last meeting that Reagan and Gorbachev. I'll go back to that one just for 1 second.
Sure.
I had gotten in because I had to really cobble together a request to get a press card to get into this final meeting because the Americans had run out of photo passes. So I had to get one from the Soviets, and they were not unnice about it, but they were just kind of bureaucratic, and I had to sit around. And finally, the guy gave me a pass, and in doing so, said to me, "You can be very patient." I'd been sitting there for like 20 minutes waiting, and this thing was going to start in 10 more minutes. So I was like really desirous of getting into that room. And when we got in there, we saw that the chairs were way far apart, like 3 or 4 feet apart. And their interpreters were sitting on these little stools just behind them. And I went with a couple of the other photographers, and we talked to the Secret Service and said, we need to get a light reading up there. And so we go up, and everybody's doing their, like, you know, if your cell phone was a light meter, kind of, 60 at 3.5, 60 at 4, what do you get? And we're all yammering back and forth. And as we're doing that, we're kind of pushing the chairs, a little closer together. Because let's face it, you can't have them 5 feet apart and expect to get a picture. So, but it was one of those moments where each was listening to their own interpreter, and it just kind of made that division between East and West a little more evident. I used to be the very lucky recipient of what we referred to as the magic phone call. You know, in the days before cell phones and before voicemail, you maybe would have had a answering machine that would have little cassettes of tape, and you'd have to do your outgoing message on one tape, and then you would get the incoming message on the other tape. And when you would be out or you'd be traveling, you had a little beeper, and you just hit it like beep, beep when you'd call your own number, and it would replay for you the messages. I mean, it was real. Honestly, when you think that we had already gone to the moon and come back by the time they were inventing these crazy things in the 70s and 80s. But by and large, my point is that you really had to be there. You had to be where your phone was, or you had to come back shortly after somebody had called you. And if you happened to be there, that was really, that moment it had the potential of becoming a magic phone call. And they usually went something like this: hey, how you doing? Oh, yeah, hey, pretty good. What's going on? Well, what are you up to? And that was the question that you would always say, oh, not very much. I'm pretty open, because you didn't want to immediately appear that you didn't want to look like you had no work, but you didn't want to be so busy that they weren't going to offer you the reason they called. And I said, well, what's happening? He said, well, we've got this story we're doing on this new music called reggae, and it's kind of coming out of Jamaica. It's just making it's a kind of new music, and the music writer wants to do a piece about it. And I thought we'd send you and Dave DeVos, who was the Time. This came from Time magazine. David was the Time magazine reporter in Los Angeles, and I had worked with him 4 years before in Vietnam. We knew each other pretty well. So it's like, okay, I'll meet you in Ocho Rios and let's see where this thing goes. So he was an LA correspondent. So by then he kind of was a little more into the entertainment world. I was still a New York guy, and I was not terribly into the world of entertainment, although I'd done a few things, but this was just meet a bunch of musicians and people, singers, and it was like the whole mob of Island Records, which was by that point they had really become the biggest franchise of reggae singers, and they brought all these people up to Ocho Rios to meet press people, and so it was kind of a semi-official thing. But then being Jamaica, it was pretty loose, and you'd find somebody here, you just wander around. There'd be a band would have maybe had a little session. They'd all just be sitting around. It was like great pictures. Everywhere you looked, it was great pictures. And everywhere we went, people would say something like, well, when are you going to see Bob? It's like, the first day I wondered who they meant. And by the second day, I realized, yeah, they're all talking about Bob Marley. Apparently, he's the man here. And so after we did 5 days up with all these different groups, we went to Kingston, and we spent an afternoon with Bob Marley. And it was really very moving and quite wonderful. He was a super smart, not much book education, but great street education, and a real poet. And he could write and sing, and he could, he and the reporter had this hour and a half, 2 hour interview that just kept going on and on, which was great for me as a photographer, because little moments when they would be engaged, by then they didn't even know, Bob didn't even really know I was there. I would just be shooting and trying to figure out what my exposure was. Like, yeah, let's see, Tri-X, what about 125 at 4.5 or 5.6, maybe open up a little bit, his skin's pretty dark, we'll go up another half stop. And you're just kind of in the photographer bouncing around in the middle of this guy who I had really never even heard of before I got to Jamaica, and who came to understand, and what an amazing talent he was. And this was in New Orleans in 2005, right after actually 2006, about 6 months after Hurricane Katrina had come through the Gulf Coast and just inundated New Orleans. And I had a story there for the National Geographic, and I had convinced them that maybe this ought to be a 4x5 project. And I shot digital. I mean, by then I had a 5D digital camera, but I was really looking to shoot everything 4x5 when I could. So pretty much these two pictures, including this picture of Herb Gettridge, who was from this black neighborhood, the lower 9th Ward of New Orleans, kind of down the hill from the bridge and hang a left. And it was one of these places that just got terribly flooded because the dikes gave way, the water came in, everybody lost everything in their house, 6-8 feet of water in their house. And this was one of the first days he came back to his house. He was 81 years old, had built the house room by room back in the 50s, and was not ready to give it up. And just meeting this guy and just sharing some of the tough, terrible story that he had personally gone through. His wife had gone off to live with some relatives in Detroit until he could get the electricity back on. And that didn't happen in that neighborhood for months, like 6 months. I mean, most houses were completely ruined. He was able to more or less save his place. And it really was so moving, and was a lovely, wonderful guy, passed away 2 years ago, but he was the first guy back in their house in the lower Ninth Ward. And this was, again, this was just one last thing about that picture. Natural light, 4x5 on a tripod, 30th at f2, and even with like 100-speed color film, you can get away with a lot. You can really get away with a great deal. 30th of a second, I had this little, still use a little Velbon tripod, like a $50 tripod, but it's just steady enough that it'll hold the camera steady. You don't need the big Gitzo, you don't need the gigantic Bogan. You just need something that's going to hold your camera steady enough for that 15th or 8th of a second. Okay. This was another picture from the Pad 39 at Cape Kennedy, Cape Canaveral, the space shuttle. This was not the last one. This was the one time I actually got to go up on the vehicle assembly building, which was this gigantic building where they had put the Saturn V's together to go to the moon, and they put the space shuttles, they mate them to the fuel tanks and the solid rocket boosters. So this is a big building, and it's got gigantic cranes and elevators and everything. But the day of the launch, it's a really great place to be because you're up, I don't know, 400, 500 feet or something. It's a big building, and you're up on top, so you're not looking just up at it, the launch. You're kind of looking a little more sideways at it. And I love this picture because in a way there was something about just the trace of the smoke that I liked about. This was, again, a 4x5, and I made 2 frames that day, and that's one of them. So this picture was shot in July of 1969, also known as 50 years ago last summer, on the morning of the launch of Apollo 11, which was the first mission that Aldrin and Armstrong landed on the moon. And last year was a big deal because of the 50-year anniversary, and I had a show in a number of places, like a gallery in San Francisco, and the Leica Gallery in Washington, and the Museum of Flight in Seattle. It was a pretty big deal because really what it was, and this is something that most people don't remember, which is that Apollo 11 was launched 2 weeks before Woodstock, and in the summer of '69. And the way people came and gathered and camped out and were just hanging out together, it was really like, this was sort of like Woodstock for the space age crowd. So as the rocket is going up, everybody's got their hands up in front of their faces because you're looking 9:30 in the morning in the bright Florida sun, and you're looking directly east at the rocket. So everybody had to put a hand up, and it became this kind of visual poetry of what everybody had to do just to be able to see the rocket go. Well, this picture is from Vietnam, and I have to say I'm still kind of looking to find out who this guy is. I thought about 5 years ago, I thought I'd found him, and it turned out that it probably was not him. It was kind of complicated. It's like you would think somebody would know what they looked like 50 years ago, but that doesn't always happen. This was a young American soldier reading a letter from home in between fixing the treads on a tank in Vietnam in the spring of 1971. And I kind of consider this the first really good picture that I ever took. I'd been taking a lot of pictures for 5, 6 years, but this picture of this young guy that I just kind of happened into and had about a 10-second conversation with. And then I moved on, and he went back to reading his letter and fixing the tank, and we kind of never hooked up again. There's something about being an anonymous observer. I never worked for a newspaper. I never worked for a wire service. But information gathering skills are not as good as my photo gathering skills. So, and this picture from 1979 was the first refugees coming out of the Cambodia killing fields, and I photographed this woman and a little baby in the nursery tent at a refugee camp in Thailand, just over the border from Cambodia. And the picture actually won the press photo of the year at the World Press Photo Contest in Holland. But again, it's 42 years later, and I have no idea how to reach her, or whatever happened to that baby. You know, she would be in her 60s or maybe even 70s now, and the baby would be in his or her 40s. So I feel bad that I've never been very good about it, but working for magazines, it wasn't nearly as important that you get name and hometown and all those little facts that the wires and the newspapers photographers are extremely good at. And I have to say, I wish I had a little bit more of that.
I just want to add that one of the shows that we have in the works, and hopefully we'll be able to get it up in the fall. Don't know if we'll be able to have a live opening for it, but we definitely would do a video opening, is that 2020 actually is the 75th anniversary and the 45th anniversary of the end of both World War II and Vietnam. So we are working on a show with Contact Press, which is David Agency, to highlight the work from that time. So there'll be a lot more of David's work coming up, in that show that we'll have hopefully in the fall. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Well, today is the 75th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe.
Yeah.
So everybody should go home and break open a bottle of wine or a Kronenberg beer. And I thought it was interesting that the president spoke to Putin about it yesterday, but he hasn't spoken to the Brits or the French about it, apparently. What a surprise.
Yes.
This was a picture of some 82nd Airborne troops in Grenada in December 1983. I had just been this was after Reagan sent the troops in to safeguard the medical students, or some other reason. I'm not sure really what it was, but this was bringing baseball back. They're bringing baseball back to the Olympics, but in 2008, it was the end of Olympic baseball. I think they were thinking, oh, the Americans always win it. Well, the Americans didn't always win it. Very often it was the Koreans or the Cubans or the Dominicans. But that was in Korea. But if they have the Olympics in Tokyo, which were supposed to be in a couple of months, and now it looks like next year, baseball is coming back. And this was the Penn relays, which are this great track meet every April, except of course this year. And the American pole vaulting champion Lawrence Johnson just cleared the bar, shot with a Mamiya 7. And these cameras, most of the time you get one shot. It's not, I have some stuff that's 20 frames a second. I shoot with the Sony A9 cameras, and for sports they're amazing because you can get 15 or 20 frames a second. And when you're onto something, when you know that something's going to happen, 20 frames a second will give you a lot more choices about what's in between all those little pictures that you thought you had something, and you'll start to discover things going on that you never saw before. But there's also a place in which having a camera where you just have to wait and bing, make one shot. And this is another one of those. This is at the London Olympics in 2012. An American runner waiting for the baton in the 4x400. I think the 400
That's what you
4
had
by
told me.
400.
Yeah.
And I don't know, there's something just beautifully ballet-ish about it, the way he's turned around and kind of waiting. Next picture is this is the air sick bag. We gave everybody an air sick bag when needed. This is Sochi Winter Olympics 2014 and a ski jumper. This is what it looks like. I mean, these people they're really tough and really crazy they're going to go all the way down that chute and then leap into the air and go another 100 yards in the air. It's really a trip. And I was when you get up top, you just want to show what it's like. You just want to show what it's like, and that's what it looks like. So yeah, it's pretty cool. This was at the 1984 Olympics, my picture of the American runner Mary Decker, who had been denied a chance to run at the 1980 Moscow Games because the Americans boycotted those games. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan, 1979. The U.S. boycotted the games, and so all these runners who were ready to go to Moscow and win gold medals and have these great careers had to wait. And so Mary was ready to run in '84, and Zola Budd, the young South African runner that couldn't run for South Africa because they were still practicing apartheid, but her mother was English. So she came she ran for the United Kingdom. And long story, but about the 5th lap of the 7-lap race, they collided and Mary fell down, and she did it right across from where I was. And this was in the days of no auto exposure and no autofocus. We did have motor drives, yes, but you had to focus. And it's pretty sharp. It's shot on Fujichrome 100 film. And I remember just at the moment that this all happened, just taking that extra little super slow motion, make sure you get it sharp. Doesn't last very long, but you got to get it sharp. This was shot in Buenos Aires in 1974 at the funeral of Juan Perón. And I managed to tuck my way up into the rotunda, big dome like the American Capitol building. It's kind of big dome with a little rotunda on the top. And I got up there and made about 6 frames, and then the soldiers who were afraid of being found out grabbed me, but I had my 6 frames. That's all you need if you got the right 6 frames. 1973 in Chile, the coup d'etat against President Allende, and in the National Stadium one afternoon when we were being kind of taken around and shown how well everybody was being treated, and we stayed a little longer than they had expected we would be there. And they brought in some new prisoners, including this young man. And this picture was not so much in the States because the Chile coup d'etat was not nearly the story that it was in Europe, but it was a big, big story in Europe. And this picture became one of the posters that anti-junta people would rally around over the years going forward. I almost met this guy. We traded messages 7 years ago, and I hope go back in a couple of years and try. I just hope we both live that long. I'd like to meet the guy. One of those magic phone calls led to a trip in the west of Pakistan in the province of Baluchistan. And when I got there, this was 1978, and there was this whole political uproar in this province that there were people rebelling against the central Pakistani government, and those Baluch rebels had gone over to Afghanistan and were living in refugee camps there, and that's where I shot this picture. These were Baluch Pakistanis, but in Afghanistan. This was during the Iranian Revolution in 1979, just 40 years ago last year. And right before the return of Ayatollah Khomeini from France, uh, one afternoon, some soldiers drove through a crowd. Some people in the crowd yelled and swore at him, and they fired into the crowd and killed a couple of students. And these guys would, and this is what would happen to show that another martyr had fallen. They would take their hands and just dip their hands in the blood and then parade around showing that another martyr had fallen. It was pretty heavy duty. That same trip, I managed to talk my way in to see Ayatollah Khomeini after he'd been back for a few days, and nobody had really seen him up close. I'd been very nice, but very persistent with the economics professor who had been tasked with dealing with the foreign press. I was very nice to him, but after a while, I think he just thought it would be easier to get me in than to have to deal with my coming back every day. But I walked in the room and there was the picture. Sometimes you just got to get there, that's all. In 1981, December of 81, at the time of the Solidarity movement, Solidarność in Poland, and I'd only been there a day and a half, and Polish army declared martial law, and they arrested Lech Wałęsa. They closed down Solidarity, and I'd only been there a day. But that evening, and it was a Saturday night into Sunday, and then Sunday evening, I went to this church that I had been to in the morning, and I saw all these people gathered in the street holding a few candles, and that was the picture, you know, just get there. Bob Williams, an American D-Day paratroop veteran who passed away just 2 years ago now, but another one of these stories that's way too long to tell right now, but over a martini sometime if anybody wants to know the whole story. But I had talked my way into the area by the drop zone, and then I waited on the edge of the drop zone, far from the press area. I hid in a little lean-to, and I waited for these veterans to come walking off the field. And as this one guy Bob Williams came walking toward me, the sky just filled with active duty troops who had just been flown in from Germany. And it kind of made the picture to have the sky filled with parachutes. And the 74-year-old paratrooper, he was then the same age I am now. So there you go. This was a Marine on board the USS Eisenhower as we were headed to Cuba in 1994, I think. It was just a scene. Sometimes you just would be happy to see a scene, and that you'd be really happy to have a roll of Kodachrome 200 tucked away in a pocket. (1981 or 82) when there was a terrible farm crisis in the Midwest, and I went with a reporter from Der Spiegel, the German edition of, news magazine like Time or Newsweek. And one of the people we met in southeastern Iowa was a guy named Art Schwiers, and he had lost his farm. And this was back. We met him, and he said, "Well, yeah, you want to see what it looked like." And we just wandered up to the bedroom that had been the house that he'd lived in his whole adult life and raised his kids. And he just kind of sat down on this bed spring, and one of those things. I just go back for 1 second. I never really worry about too much light behind me, something backlit like this. I just want to get the light on the subject. And if it's really dark or really light back there, it just doesn't bother me. Next picture is a young boy in an Ethiopian refugee camp in the early 80s near where the water was being given out. And he was kind of just goofing around, but there was just something sort of perfectly sculpting about the way he grabbed leapt up for that last bite of water off the water spigot. Another Kodachrome. I was a Kodachrome and then later a Fuji Velvia guy when it started taking us way too long to be able to get Kodachrome processed. And Velvia was like a 1 hour film that you could do in E6, but there was something beautiful about Kodachrome. This was a balloon race in Paris in 1983. And it was just this beautiful storm. And then one of the balloons decided to go and he just kind of popped up. And of course, with balloons, nothing happens quickly. So kind of out of the corner of your eye, you just see a little movement. It's like, well, somebody's moving. I guess I better get a picture. The Bonneville Salt Flats, which is near where I grew up in Utah. And this old Henry J with probably a blown Chevy in it and capable of going like 225 miles an hour or something. And I just love the way this guy came over and just was peeking in and trying to see it. It's so bright there. You just can't believe how bright it is. So even if you're wearing like a big hat, the sun hits the white salt and comes back up underneath. So unless you're kind of covered top and bottom, you're going to have trouble dealing with all the light and you will get a sunburn, that's for sure. But this was shot with an old Noctilux lens at about f1.2 and maybe a 4,000th of a second, but wide open. I love wide open. I love fast lenses. They speak to me.
Well, this was the show that we had here that David just shared everything with for us. And I don't know if people have specific questions now about the show that we just, the work that David just showed. Again, if you want to raise your hands to ask a question, or if you are good about unmuting your own microphone, do that to ask a question. And then if not, we'll get started on the next body of work that I wanted to share with you. And this is work from David's project called The Fourth Quarter.
So Ray just said, I love this photo. It's gorgeous. Is this film? Oh, the yellow car. Yeah, that was actually shot with a Leica M9 and a Noctilux.
All righty. Well, I guess we'll move along. And this is
Okay.
a project that David's. When did you start shooting this?
Let's see. I got this is 27. No, what year are we? 2020. So 3 years ago, beginning of 2017, I got a grant. I applied for and I got a grant to do a project on older athletes, and it was the summer of 2017. Was they have every other year. I missed it last year, but every other year they have the National Senior Game. So you have competition in basketball, horseshoe, volleyball, track and field of all sorts, swimming. Swimming is a huge thing because you have a lot of 80 and 90-year-old swimmers, and they go up into the 60. You have to be at least 50, and it's every 5 years is a grouping, and people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and so this is sort of, I'm kind of a youngster amongst this group, but I do qualify. But it was just, we ended up we called the project The Fourth Quarter because it came from the fact that my wife had a get together with 4 of her college roommates. And I think it was when they were all 70 or 71. I'm 73 now, so it was a couple of years ago. And at one point, probably about the third glass of wine, one of them said, "You know what? We're the fourth quarter queens. We just get to do what we want." It wasn't there, but it was recounted to me. I thought, That's a great concept because, you know, once you hit a certain age, you realize you're in the fourth quarter. And it's kind of like all you really want to do is to ask the coach, hey, coach, can you put me in now? It's the fourth quarter. So with all
David,
these, yeah.
no, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we got a question before we get too much further along. And somebody asked, how are you viewing through when you're shooting with the 4x5 all the time?
How am I wedding? How am
How
I
are you
viewing?
viewing through the 4x5
Okay.
when you're making an image using the 4x5?
Well, there's two ways of doing a reflex camera, like a Graflex or a Mentor, or the more popular and the more obvious, which is like a speed graphic, maybe a Linhof or folding Polaroid that's been converted to 4x5, which essentially becomes a rangefinder camera. But for example, I have on the back of my speed graphic a Cambo, C-A-M-B-O, Cambo for their 4x5 cameras. They made a reflex viewing device, which basically just a little box with a mirror on it, 45-degree mirror, snaps onto the back, and it, when you look through the little viewer, you hit the mirror, and the mirror is looking through the ground glass. And you open the lens up, and you focus by looking through that hole, and that mirror is showing you what the ground glass is seeing. You really want to get the ground glass sharp. That's, if the camera's set up right, the film is exactly sitting in the same plane as the ground glass. And some people are managed to get like a separate rangefinder, like you would see on a Leica, that would just be a little window over on the side, and when you turn that and it moves the lens back and forth, you have the two images overlapping, and when it overlaps, that means they're focused. It's a bit tricky with 4x5. It's real easy to waste a lot of film if you're not sharp. I love this Campo because it's very bright, and it keeps away a lot of the ambient light. I can use it in a very bright place. I can use it at the salt flats, and I can still see what I'm looking at. Sometimes I would maybe throw a towel or something over my head. I've never really used the old dark cloth, but a lot of people, if you're shooting 8x10, you pretty much have to do that. But I've never shot 8x10. I only do 4x5. And while I know that that's a big jump from 35mm or 120 medium format, you can get such an amazing, the physicality and the physical quality of what the lenses do, even on 4x5, is very different. I can be very quick. It's just addressing Bernie's question. When I have to do a lot of things in the right order. And the thing is, like, you'll have your camera, so you have to open the back shutter of the camera, because that's the shutter I use with my big lens. Just to preface it, on a 4x5 camera, the little old lenses had a shutter in there. So you could use that shutter. You could figure out what your distance was and fire in the front. With these big old lenses that don't have a shutter, you need the shutter that exists in the back of the speed graphic camera. It's a focal plane shutter. It's right in front of the film. And so as far as the lens goes, the lens is always transmitting light. And so you're just using the shutter in the back to expose film for, 30th of a second, 500th of a second. But so you have to open the shutter, look in there, aim it where you think you're going to go, lock it down, look for focus, get the focus, lock the little focus lever so that doesn't move. And then you got to cock the shutter, and there's a little tweaky thing on the side, which is like 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4 if you're going to 500 a second. Then you got to take the film holder, put that in there, pull the dark slide out, and now you're ready to shoot. That's a lot of things to do in a very specific order, which is one reason that we have a lot, we screw up a lot, because it's very easy to make a mistake. On the other hand, when you get something you like, it's great. So yeah, these anyway, fourth quarter ends up being, yeah, and anyway, I can be pretty quick with it. I can do everything again in about 10 seconds and get a second frame. Like if somebody blinks and I see that they blinked on the first frame, pum, 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 and then the next time, 10 seconds later, bang, I try and get it without them blinking. So these pictures were all made of these swimmers who are in their 70s, 80s, 90s, many of them in their 90s. This is someone who wrote on their arm what the event was, what the heat was, and what the lane was, and the 200 individual medley and the 50 butterfly. And so they wouldn't forget what they had to do. They wrote it on their arm. I love that. But these people are tough. And it's kind of my generation. So I really got into this because I turn out to be one of the younger people in this crowd when I'm with these people. And they don't give up. This was like a 75-year-old women's volleyball team. And like 75 to 80-year-old women's basketball team. And they're just all over each other. Coaches are yelling. I mean, you would think it was like Iowa girls basketball or something. They are just at it and they're in each other's faces and the yelling never stops. It's really fun. This in Iowa and where else? Kansas and maybe Missouri, there's a sport called granny basketball, which was invented to try and let older women play, but with less chance of getting knocked over or falling down or getting hurt. So you have 3 zones and you have to stay either in your offense, neutral, or defensive zone. You can only dribble a couple of times. So anyway, this is the team from Harpers Ferry, Iowa, and they had just won the state championship the week before. And they're a tough squad. This was the javelin at the men's senior games, I think 75 to 80. An unsuccessful attempt at pole vaulting. This guy's not quite up there like Lawrence Johnson, the American champion, but you know, even at 70, they're still trying to get over that bar. This was race walking, which is that silly looking sport, you know, when you see people kind of wobbling as they're walking really fast, but it's something that people can do well into their 80s and 90s. So it has a huge following. This was at the Huntsman Games in Southern Utah. And this was I think the New Jersey Senior Games, like a 200-meter sprinter, an 80-year-old sprinter. These guys they were kids. They were like maybe 60, 65 in the 100 meters. 100 meters is great because that's where everybody just is like going full out 110% the whole time. And you really see some great, just the musculature and the energy is really great. And that's the start of 100 meters. One of the women's hundreds, probably like mid 50s or maybe 60s. I still shoot some with a infrared camera. I just got one of my Sony A7 or 3s changed over to infrared, and I haven't really, given what's happened, I haven't really been out shooting with it yet, but I love shooting black and white with these infrared cameras. They're just off enough that they make you kind of come back and appreciate black and white. This was the end of the swimming round, which was the first of the triathlon, and you had everybody from 60 to, I think there were a couple of late 80s triathletes, and they'd all go swim out in the big pond and then come back and come running up and grab a bicycle. This guy was a member of the South End Rowing Club in San Francisco. and had just come out of swimming a couple of miles in San Francisco Bay. At the Gleason's Gym in Brooklyn, one of the more famous gyms where a lot of boxers have trained over the years. And this woman in her late 50s was knocking on the bag pretty good. There isn't a sport you can find that you don't have seniors active in it. This guy was at the, it's funny, I just noticed he wearing a Huntsman shirt, but this was at the Lakeland, Florida senior powerlifters. These were weightlifters, and they got the most amazing expressions on their faces. This was like my favorite group, the Gray Wolves, which are this group of older guys, mostly in their 60s. Like the guys in the back row here are all in their 60s, and they're the kids. The guy in the shoulder pads up front here is, when I shot this, he was 89. And the guy in the Chiefs shirt next to him was 90. And they play ice hockey twice a week for like 2 hours at a go, twice a week, every week. And these guys, age is nothing to them. This was three late 60s. I think one of them was 70 years old, but all three of these guys are surfers out in Santa Cruz. And between the three of them had a total of 10 replaced body parts, if you count shoulders, knees, etc. And this was a 50-odd-year-old skateboarder at a park in Fort Lauderdale. And, you know, I'm looking down over like into the Grand Canyon from the top of this platform, looking straight down. I mean, you look over the edge, you start to get the whirlies. And these guys are doing it on skateboards. It's really a trip to watch.
Well, David, we got another question is, can you discuss your decision to shoot in black and white?
Yeah, I love black and white. I mean, I love color. I love black and white. I love both. What I would say is that I think there is this kind of timeless quality to black and white that, although right now looking at the board with all the stuff that's there in color, I would not really have altered any of those. I mean, I started shooting color with Ektachrome. Ektachrome wasn't that great a film. Eventually I got into Kodachrome, which was a much better film to shoot, even though it had a lot of problems in terms of turnaround time and so forth. But I just remain convinced that there's something classic about black and white. I love it when I can convince somebody who's asked me to shoot for them to do it in black and white. Sometimes, great thing about digital is when you shoot digital, you're basically shooting color. And there are all these really handy ways of converting color digital files to black and white. So it doesn't have to be as, like in old days, if you shot Tri-X, that was never going to be in color. Now we have, thing is now we live in this age of richness where everything is available and everything is possible. And there's no excuses anymore. You know, everybody's making great cameras. You've got no excuses to get an in focus, well exposed picture. Those excuses are gone. So infrared. No, infrared is a, there's a guy, I don't know what they call themselves, it's Kolari Vision, K-O-L-A-R-I, in New Jersey, South Jersey or Central New Jersey. And they put some, I don't know what they do. They put something in your camera in front of the chip, in front of the sensor, that makes it read only certain kinds of infrared light. And I got this done to one of my 5D Canons, and I love that camera. I'm probably going to end up selling it just because I don't need a whole fleet of infrared cameras. But this A7 III Sony's beautiful camera. I really can't wait to start shooting with it. When I came down, I'm down in Florida right now. When I came down here a month and a half ago, I just came very light. Got a few cameras. I didn't bring everything. Didn't think I'd be here this long. So I've got things to do when I get home. But the infrared, there's a few pictures here that are shot with it. Well, a couple, yeah, not all of them, but several of the, like that's an infrared. You know, what I really hate is when people say, "Hey man, nice infrared picture," which is like saying, "Hey man, really nice 28 to 70." You know, it's like, it's so stupid. It doesn't matter if it's infrared or not. To me, it's just trying to figure out how to use something enough that when you use it, it gives you a look or a feeling or an interpretation that you want. But it kind of pisses me off when people are like, "Oh, they're so cool. They knew it was infrared." Really? That makes you cool, huh? I'm shocked.
Did you
So
see
some of these are
David, the question, what film do you use in your 4x5?
4x5 film, Tri-X, HP5, which is Ilford black and white. If I shoot color, it tends to be the Kodak Portra color negative. I don't like. I mean, for a while I was shooting a lot of Fuji transparency 4x5. When you get it right, it's really good. But boy, that stuff is so unforgiving. If you haven't shot it for a while, you're better off just going back to black and white.
Any other questions that
Barry,
people may
thank
have?
you for coming, Barry. Appreciate it. Oh, the House impeachment hearings. Well, it was, I think I'm pretty much the only guy who had shot the Nixon hearings, the Clinton hearings, and the Trump hearings. And it's, the thing about impeachment is it's tough because there aren't that many. Like this year, it was a very different kind of setup, the way they had the witnesses, and it was mostly about the Ukraine, and there weren't that many other issues. Whereas during, it was, Clinton was a little bit crazy because that was kind of, oh, he lied to the FBI about Monica Lewinsky, and then you had Nixon, who had really been operating a pretty rough operation. So I shot it 4x5. I took this wonderful 4x5 camera I have called the Liberator. It's a Graflex modified with a really fast lens, an Aero Ektar fast lens, and when you're shooting it, when your lens is like an f2.5, when you're shooting Tri-X, it's amazing how often you can get away with a 30th 2.5 and without lights. So I haven't put lights up in years. I'm just a natural guy. I put my energy in getting a good solid tripod. If the camera doesn't move, you have a chance.
Anything else?
Hey, David,
Yes.
I have a question. Actually, I have a couple of questions. First, thank you very much for presenting your unbelievable body of work to us. I mean, I know it's only a
Thanks.
fraction of it, but very generous of you. So thank you very much for that. First question is, do you have a favorite memory of shooting Bob Marley? I believe you did that in Europe, if I'm not mistaken, or in England.
Well, Marley was both in Jamaica. We spent an afternoon at Tuff Gong at his house in Kingston. And then I traveled with the band in Europe for 4 or 5 days during the beginning of the Exodus tour.
Right.
And the cool thing about it, we don't have the picture up here, but I had what I call a slit camera, which was an old Canon 55mm rangefinder camera that the shutter died. So I pulled the shutter out, put in 2 pieces of like silver tape, and just left a tiny slit, so that now you were not getting a whole exposure across the whole 35mm frame, but only in where that slit was, so that the film would get exposed by running, there it is, there we go, by running the film past this slit as your subject ran in front of the camera. And so as he would run, his image would be moving along and the film would be running, and you kind of lay the film down, or the image down on the film as it went through. And it's a very imprecise guess. It's just all guesswork. And but I made this picture and a couple others. And I had him running back and forth. I think he was a really good sport about it. He ran like 10 times, and each time he did it, I'd have to be winding. Okay, Bob, go, run. I mean, I'm sure he thought I was pretty much crackers. So that was early '76. And summer '77, a year later, I meet him in Paris. And Time magazine hadn't done much for those pictures, but one of the French music magazines took that picture and ran it across 2 pages. And so when I saw him the next time, I flipped open to this picture and I showed him this one. And he had never seen anything like that before of himself. And I think at that moment, he just thought, okay, this guy really does have film in the camera. And basically, I could do whatever I wanted. I rode on the bus with the band. I went to the shows. I went to sound check. I hung out with him. And it was great. My only real regret is that I didn't, at the end of my 4 or 5 days for Rolling Stone, I didn't say, gosh, guys, I don't really have to be anywhere. How about if I hang out on the bus for another few days? Is that cool? And I'm sure they would have been fine with it, but I stupidly didn't. What can I tell you?
Anybody else?
You never know when you're going to get a picture you like. But, well, you do in digital. You can just kind of look at your camera there. It's like, talk about spoiled. Well, there he is himself. There's little Tyrone is the dog in the car, right? Not the guy on the bike, just to be clear here. And I thought I was going to bring him in here for a quick cameo, but I don't think he's going along with it. He's not going along with it.
If nobody has any other questions, I want to thank everybody for coming and participating today. Especially want to thank David took the time out of his day to be with everybody, to do this talk for me, for you guys. As I said, I've known David for a while. We met, when were the Salt Lake Olympics? How many years ago were those?
2002.
Yeah, so a long time. And did a big piece for him for a big Olympic show that was held in the Boston area, and met and stayed in touch. And it's a great honor, as I said earlier, to be able to work with David and print his work. And before we sign off, I just want to remind people that we have our next gallery talk is going to be on Thursday, the 21st of the month, and that will be with Neil Rantoul and Rick Ashley. And what we're going to try is we're going to do a 5 o'clock start to see. We've heard from a couple people that even though they're at home, they're still working regular kind of business day. So that talk, will start at 5 on the 21st, and we'll be sending out the reminders. And then one last thing, if anybody here is listening and has any interest in the printing workshop that I'm offering online, that starts on Tuesday next week. So reach out to me if you have interest. And again, thank you all very, very much for participating. in being here and spending a little time with us. So we thank
So
you all.
this was a good crowd. Thank you, guys. And a couple good questions there. Oh, hang on one second. Come here, come here, come here, come here, buddy. Come here, hang on. All right.
Okay. We'll get to see the star of the show.
Bob, thank you. This was fabulous.
Hang on. Whoa. Okay. There we go. Where's the earphone? Here we are. Yeah. All right. So I just want you to know he really, he still likes me, okay? Mm-hmm.
But if you follow Little Tyrone on Instagram, and a lot of times you will get to see a lot of David's lens tests, so you can follow along there.
Lots
Not
of
only
lens tests. There'll be a lot of lens testing.
you'll get to see what he's shooting in the new lenses, along with Little Tyrone.
Yes, sir. Well, thanks, guys. Appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, David. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, David.
See you, buddy. Thank you.